has some ups and it should be fine for everybody. So thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful forum. I'm really sorry that we didn't manage to meet in person in Paris, but I think I will leave it like that because we always say that in the last couple of months so often that. So I should just point on the fact that I'm super happy that we're now meeting here and we're all healthy. So thank you very much. And I want to just for the introduction, I want to take up something Emmanuel said with the generational or the generational part of occupation studies of the First World War. I remember, I think it was in 2009 when I was first invited to a bunch or group of people speaking about in a workshop in Munich about occupation. And I remember there was really a handful of people only who dealt with First World War and occupation regime. And I was really happy to see this group of people interested in such important topic of history growing and growing and growing. And that there is so much new work came out, which I would say it like that. It would have been great to have that when finishing my book. So it would help enrich my book a lot. So what do I want to say in the next 15 to 20 minutes? So I should really get into it now. So what I want to say is what I extremely came across in the beginning. So when I, somehow, let's say it like that, first generation of occupation historians started to do research on this topic, is that very often I came across an unreflected pointing on the occupier A did this on occupied B and so on. So what I always had the feeling this didn't catch what I read in my sources from the archives is that there was never the occupier or the occupied. Rather, the occupier was a mixture of different political interests, different occupation regimes, different personalities engaged in this occupation regime. And so were the occupied, so the population of these regions which were occupied, it was different kind of political interests, political parties. So I always had the feeling in the beginning when reading publications that there was no reflection on that. Of course, it's a kind of tricky because we all know there is we have bird counts, maximum bird count, so we cannot catch these. But I think it's to think over that if you use this, the occupier did this and that, or the occupied behaved this and that, just to reflect a bit on that. And on the example of Serbia and Montenegro during the First World War occupied by the Habsburg monarchy, I want to just point on some issues why it's almost impossible to speak about the occupiers did this and that in Serbia and Montenegro. So first of all, and it's always a language issue, we already had this in the beginning of this panel, it's a language issue. So Austro-Hungary occupied modern Serbia and Montenegro during the First World War. And of course, I had, what I did for my book in the beginning was to somehow show them all and compare political interests there. But Serbia and Montenegro kept me more interested simply because I can read the documents and I know the languages. So this is the reason why I dig deeper in Serbia and Montenegro. But there is also a more academic argument for that because Habsburg monarchy established so-called military general government, militär general gouvernements. So they were comparable from an administrative point of view because somehow they had to be administered similarly. Also the occupation, when they started, were somehow at the same time. So Serbia in autumn 1915 and Montenegro followed in January 1916. I think this is also very important because, I mean, as we all know, also occupation front lines and home front situation are so strongly connected. So if you, for example, lose the backing of the population, if there are unrest in the homeland, then it's really hard to catch up occupation regimes or to press or squeeze. You need to press or squeeze more out of these occupied countries because you need the food and everything for your own people, or you at least occupier tries to do so. So that's the point in time when the occupation started and how the situation is in the home front or hinterland is really important. And what I want to show today is on the one hand, and it's on the example because I had to choose, it's on the example of course, the perspective of the occupier, because I focused on that mostly when I did my research. So the one point is what I want to show is that there is never the occupier. Oh, just to think over applying the on the occupier or the occupied. And on the other hand, I want to show that there is not the occupation regime. Rather, all occupation regimes are a bunch of different microcosms of experience and politics in these occupied countries. So it means there is also a heterogeneity on the part of the occupied, which I will also show with some examples. But it's also not the occupation regime. Rather, it has different regions, but people experience the occupation regime differently. But also that the occupier somehow had to reflect on the local situation, and thus this regime differed from place to place. Just to point out to scholars, because my content is, I don't tell you anything new, but I just want to throw this into discussion because we're meeting here for discussion today. I mean, for example, Isa Blumi already mentioned that, especially in the Balkans, but it's not only in the Balkans. You can just talk about the people, the occupied population involved, the Serbs or the Albanians or the Montenegrins, because they have followed different political interests. Also, František Žižek, historian from Prague, he regularly points on the fact that Montenegro is not just the Montenegrins, but they had totally different political interests. Also, when it comes to during the occupation, how they perceive the best future state of Montenegro as it should be. What is also what I always came across and was really interested in that is that even, especially when I investigated the military court files from the occupied zones, is that even single commanders on a very low level can totally influence violence or how violent his region is. So it's also up to the personality. Maybe I should skip that because I'm talking so long, is that if you're investigating from an occupier's point of view or occupier's administration, occupier's interest in Serbia and Montenegro, when it comes to the Habsburg monarchy, I mean, the sources in the archives are really rich. There is more available than one historian can ever research on his or her own. But what was really hard for me every time I tried to trace decision-making processes, for example, from Vienna to the occupied regions or back then, one brickstone was missing. So you have something happened in the occupation regime. It was reported to Cetinje, to the head of the government, and then it was reported to Vienna. And then it was in Vienna, several people spoke about how to react on that. Should we issue a new order or what to do? And then it went back. And very often it was just one brickstone. So although it's so rich, the documents are so rich in the archives, always one brickstone is missing so that you cannot catch the full decision-making process, although there is so much sources. Why do they differ? So, for example, why do Montenegro and Serbia differ in general when it came to the occupiers' perceptions about these countries? Serbia, of course, was blamed for having caused the war, and you can really find this sense towards Serbian population from administrative sources and orders that followed political interest and decision-making. But you also find this from ordinary soldiers to to generals, diaries, or autobiographical sources in general, they blamed Serbia. So when they entered Serbia and occupied or started their jobs in the occupied region, they had this strong prejudice that you cannot trust Serbs. So even if a Serb somehow tried to be cooperative, they suspected him of being treacherous or prone to unrest. Totally different with Montenegro, for example. I would say it's not that the ordinary Habsburg soldier or military or even low-rank officer was so into the Montenegrins, but it was just, there was not that strong prehistory like with Serbia. So they at least didn't really know what Montenegro means or what the people are doing there. So this is the reason why, and this is also, again, traceable in the military court files. Not all are preserved in archives today, but many districts of these two occupied countries are preserved. And you can see this when, for example, the commander had to deal with an issue in which a Montenegrin or a Serb was accused of working against the occupation regime. And then you really see that in Serbia, so most ended in the best way, that this person was interned or there was a death penalty, and this happened really often. And then you see a Montenegrin who almost did the same, like this Serb citizen, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire said, well, he was drunk and let him go, which is really interesting. So it's the same action this occupied person took, but they were treated differently just because of the prejudice or majority of prejudices of the occupied personnel towards the local population. What is also really important to say is that, and this is also Montenegro on Serbia, what they have in common is there is a huge Muslim Albanian / Turkish population living there, so in South Serbia in the former Sanjak. And you really see that the occupation personnel treated them differently when comparing it to the Orthodox population. So, and again, military code files are a really interesting source because they tell you that they did not treat them with the same. So when a Muslim from the Sanjak did something against the occupier, and if you compare that a Serb in the north of Serbia did the same, or a Montenegrin, that the Muslim was treated much better. So it's very often he was released or excused and so on. So you can trace that. So, and already what I said, that there is some kind of microcosms appearing within one occupation regime. We only on that, what I've said already, it's clear that if you say like the occupier behaved in a this or that violent way, so that the population of Serbia experienced the occupation regime this way, it cannot be said like a monolith. It's more like in the south part. So if you had been a Muslim in the Sanjak, life was maybe much easier and there was less violence from the part of the occupier than it was from a Serb in the northern parts of Serbia. What is also exceptional violent, and this is also very interesting, came across so often, is this Shabbat incident. So when the Austrians entered Shabbat and then started taking hostages, shooting, and there was, so if there is something like on a regional level an experience of extraordinary violence, then this, like the Shabbat region, it stays like this. So it became violent, and all these soldiers, occupation soldiers, talked to each other, and they told each other, yeah, be aware, in Shabbat you can rely on no one. And so you really see that also then even little incidents which took place on behalf of the population were really harshly persecuted, sorry. What is also really important, and again, I would say that these court files are really interesting, and maybe I want to put this or keep this idea for the general discussion, is if there is also these court files available for other occupation regimes. So in Austro-Hungarian, especially in the military general government, the local commander was responsible for this So he headed the military court, which consisted of military judges, but very often, and the longer the war lasted, it was reserve officers who in their civilian life worked as lawyer or studied law, who were then included into this local Kreiskommando, Militärgericht, so the local district military court. And so we also have to compare that if it's still frontline or the rear area, so not a military general government, but there is not like this administrative structure. So the commander has the right to shoot someone if an incident happens. But if it's located in a military general government, at least officially, they have to set up this court and they have to do investigations. And this court files very often comprise interviews with all people involved, own soldiers, but also locals who took part in this incident. So very often these court files are really like this size, and you can really go through. And it's also really interesting what has happened. And so this brings me to another point. It's like the occupier, especially for Habsburg monarchy, where the army consisted of so many different nationalities, and some of these nationalities had the same nationality like the enemy. And so it's like in the Habsburg monarchy, the army Serbs fought against Serbs, wearing different uniforms belonging to different states. The same goes for Italian speakers or Romanian speakers. So it was like on the same nationality, but on the other side of the front. And this is what I find what all of this find really interesting is that although there was this huge distrust of Serbs, and lots of Serbs were interned and badly treated in the monarchy itself, so like in Bosnia-Herzegovina, there is a really good article by Heiner Grunert, which was published a couple of months ago in the volume of Mark Cornwall, Sparkling Sarajevo, sorry, you can Google that, how there was really like a Hasenjagd, we would say in German, like the local population of who are not Serbs running and denouncing Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But on the other hand, then you find that Orthodox soldiers from Bosnia, or let's call them Serbs, were stationed in occupied Serbia doing gendarme work. So it was, and I looked into the court files, like where they were stationed, and I found almost no incidents with Orthodox or with Serbs from Bosnia when being occupied in Serbia, which is really interesting. Also, my theory is, unfortunately, never had time to do this research on my own, that they were already like, so they sent no Orthodox or no Serb from Bosnia to occupy Serbia, who was not, but of which they were not convinced that he's absolutely reliable. On the other hand, so this was a really low number maybe, and they were already carefully picked. But on the other hand, when I said there is this court file, interestingly, when I first worked with the court files, I had the feeling like there should be most incidents where someone from the population did something, but it's not like that. So in some districts, it's mostly own soldiers and not drunkenness or these silly things soldiers usually do if they're not doing life-threatening jobs, like at the front lines, but if they're sitting somewhere just guarding or doing boring stuff. So no, it's very often that especially Slovenes and Czechs or it's called of Czech nationality or perceived Czech nationality did something illoyal during doing occupation job in Serbia and Montenegro, which was called against the monarchy, like singing songs or fraternization with the occupied. And that's also really interesting because it's also up the composition of nationalities of the occupying soldiers involved. If a district was more, or there were more violent reactions towards the occupier or not. So it's also the composition of these. what is also really important, and maybe I should then stop and just throw it into the discussion, is, and maybe it's not so comparable, because we have this Austria-Hungary, we have not only this, since the compromise settlement Ausgleich in 1867, where responsibilities between these two halves of the former empire somehow separated, and there was a joint army, the Habsburg army, but there were two parliaments, two constitutions, and also two territorial land forces, the Honved and the Landwehr. And what is really interesting, and this is why Serbia can be somehow also, or I say, if you want to really study what was going on in Serbia, don't look into the files which are located in the War Ministry in Vienna, but you have to go to Budapest and deal with Hungarian politics. István Tisza, the Hungarian minister president, already before Serbia was occupied, declared that Serbia should be occupied or overlooked by Hungarian politicians, by Hungary and not by Vienna. And interestingly, in the beginning, when Serbia was occupied in autumn, Vienna started to, or the War Ministry started to implement it in a way that they picked the generals, they picked the civil commissioner, and everybody of high-ranking position located in Belgrade. But then István Tisza did a tour through occupied Serbia in spring 1916. And after this, and almost everybody was replaced. There was a new civil commissioner. The civil commissioner had to be a Hungarian. The field of responsibility was enlarged for the civil commissioner. And also, and this is really interesting, is that most occupying, so the ordinary soldiers who were doing the occupation job in Serbia, but for the bulk from the Honved or ethnic Hungarians, so infantry regiments of the joint army, but recruiting from Hungary, which again, because the ethnic composition of Hungary were for the majority not ethnic Hungarians. So Montenegro and Serbia thus also differ in a way like that. In Montenegro, it was to put it bluntly, occupied from Vienna, and Serbia from Budapest. And I think I leave it like that because I'm already speaking almost 20 minutes. So thank you very much for joining us today and for listening. I'm very much looking forward to Christopher's paper.